I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I need to get it out of my head before it consumes me completely. Or maybe I just want to warn others not to be as stupid as I was. Either way, here it is. My story. It started with a stupid argument with my girlfriend. We've been together for 3 years, and it was one of those fights that started over nothing but escalated into everything. I stormed out of the apartment, needing air and space to cool down. I wandered around for a bit, ended up at a bar, and drank more than I should have. By the time I got back home, she was asleep, and I was still pissed. I don't even remember how I ended up on the dark web that night. I guess I was looking for something to distract me, something to take my mind off the fight. I'd dabbled in it before, buying some shady stuff, but nothing too crazy. This time, though, I found myself in some of the darker corners, where the weird and the illegal collide in ways you can't even imagine. That's when I saw it, an ad that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Custom pets, anything you want. It had a picture of a dog, but something was off about it. The eyes were too human, and the body looked like it had been pieced together from different animals. But I was drunk and angry, and I thought it was a joke. I clicked on it. The site was basic, just text on a black background. Ever wanted a pet that's truly unique? We can make your dreams come true. Anything you want, no limits. There was a form to fill out with your details and what kind of pet you wanted. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I filled it out. I wrote that I wanted a dog, something special, something that would scare the shit out of anyone who saw it. I added that it should be loyal to me and only me. I didn't expect anything to come of it. But a few days later, I got an email. Order confirmed, delivery in 7 days. No sender, no contact info, just that. I tried to brush it off as a prank, but part of me was curious. What if it was real? A week later, a plain white van pulled up outside my apartment. A guy in a black hoodie got out, opened the back, and started unloading a large crate. He wheeled it up to my door without a word, handed me a clipboard to sign, and left. The crate was heavy, and there was no sound from inside, just a label. Handle with care. I dragged it inside and pried it open with a crowbar. Inside was a dog, if you could call it that. It was bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, almost wolf-like, with matted black fur and eyes that seemed to glow red in the dim light. Its teeth were sharp, almost like fangs, and its paws were massive, tipped with claws that looked more like talons. But the worst part was its face. It looked almost human, like someone had taken a dog and given it a human-like expression. It stared at me with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. I should have been terrified, but part of me was fascinated. I named it Shadow. It took to me immediately, following me around the apartment, never making a sound. My girlfriend was less than thrilled. She hated it on sight, said there was something wrong with it, that it scared her. We fought about it, of course, but I wouldn't listen. I had paid for it, after all. It was mine. The first night it was with us, I woke up to find it standing by the bed, staring at us. Its eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and I could hear it breathing, this low, growling sound. I told it to go lie down, and it did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for something. Things got worse from there. Shadow started acting more aggressive, especially towards my girlfriend. It would growl at her, baring its fangs, and she swore it tried to bite her once. I told her she was imagining things, but deep down, I was starting to get scared too. There was something wrong with this dog. Then, one night, I came home to find my girlfriend gone. There was blood on the floor, leading from the living room to the bedroom. My heart was pounding as I followed the trail. It led to the closet, where I found her, or what was left of her. She was torn apart, her body shredded like paper, and Shadow was sitting there, covered in blood, looking at me with those red eyes. I don't remember much of what happened next. I think I screamed, tried to push it away, but it was too strong. It pinned me to the ground, its teeth inches from my face. I thought it was going to kill me, but instead, it just stared at me, almost like it was waiting for something. Then it got up and left, disappearing into the night. I called the police, but they didn't believe me. They said it was a wild animal attack, that my girlfriend must have let something in. But I knew the truth. Shadow was no ordinary dog. It was something else, something evil. And it was still out there, waiting. I've been looking for it ever since, trying to find out where it came from, what it is. But the deeper I dig, the more I realize I may never get the answers I need. All I know is that I made a terrible mistake, and now I'm paying for it. If you ever see an ad on the dark web for custom pets, don't click on it. No matter how curious you are, no matter how much you think it's a joke, it's not. And you might end up with something far worse than you ever imagined. Please learn from my mistake. And if you ever see a dog with glowing red eyes, run. I couldn't sleep after what happened. I kept seeing my girlfriend's mutilated body every time I closed my eyes. The cops had cleaned up the mess, but the memories stuck, haunting me. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The place felt tainted, like Shadow's presence lingered in every corner. I moved to a new place across town, a shitty little studio apartment, just to get away. But even there, I couldn't escape the nightmares. I started drinking more, trying to drown the fear and guilt. Every night, I'd have the same dream. Shadow's red eyes staring at me from the darkness, its teeth bared in a sinister grin. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I knew I had to do something, find a way to get rid of it for good, but I didn't know where to start. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, I decided to go back on the dark web. Maybe I could find some clue, some way to trace where Shadow came from. I dug through my browser history and found the site again. It was still there, the same black background with white text. This time, though, there was a new message at the bottom. Satisfaction guaranteed. If you have any issues with your custom pet, contact us. I clicked the link and was taken to a new page with a form. I filled it out, explaining what had happened and begging for help. I didn't really expect a response, but to my surprise, I got an email a few hours later. It was from an anonymous sender, just like before. We apologize for your inconvenience. A representative will be in touch soon. A few days later, I got a knock on my door. It was the same guy in the black hoodie who had delivered the crate. He didn't say a word, just handed me a phone. The screen lit up with a video call from a man whose face was obscured by shadows. "We understand you had a problem with your order," the man said, his voice smooth and unsettling. "We take customer satisfaction very seriously." "I want it gone," I blurted out. "Shadow. It killed my girlfriend. I can't live like this." The man was silent for a moment. "Our pets are designed to be loyal to their owners. If it attacked someone, there must have been a reason." "Reason?" I shouted. "It tore her apart. What kind of sick joke is this?" "We don't joke," the man replied calmly. "However, we do offer solutions. We can send someone to retrieve the animal. There will be no charge for this service." I didn't have any other options. "Fine, just get it out of my life." The man nodded and the screen went dark. The guy in the hoodie took the phone back and left without another word. I didn't know what to expect, but I hoped this nightmare would finally be over. That night, I heard scratching at my door. My heart stopped. I knew it was Shadow. I grabbed a baseball bat and slowly approached the door, my hands shaking. I could hear its low growl on the other side, the sound sending chills down my spine. I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack. Shadow's red eyes glowed in the dim light, and it pushed its way inside, knocking me over. I scrambled to my feet, raising the bat, but it just sat there, staring at me. I was terrified, but it didn't attack. It just watched me, waiting. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was a different man, dressed in a black suit. He had a cold, expressionless face and carried a large metal cage. "Step aside," he said in a flat tone. I did as he asked, and he approached Shadow, opening the cage. Shadow didn't resist. It just walked into the cage and sat down. The man locked it and turned to me. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Your issue has been resolved." "That's it?" I asked, still in shock. "What happens now?" "That is none of your concern," he replied. "Just know that you will not be troubled by this animal again." He left without another word, taking Shadow with him. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. It felt too easy, like there was something I was missing, but I was too relieved to care. I thought it was over, but the nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Every night I dreamed of Shadow, its red eyes burning into my soul. And then there were the whispers, soft at first, but growing louder each night. They spoke of things I didn't understand, dark and twisted things. One night, I woke up to find scratches on my arms. They were deep and painful, like something had clawed at me while I slept. I had no idea how they got there. The door and windows were locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. but the scratches kept appearing, night after night. I started to lose my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise. My friends noticed, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. One night, I woke up to find my apartment in shambles. Furniture overturned, pictures smashed, walls covered in deep claw marks. It was like a tornado had ripped through the place. And in the middle of it all, I found a note, written in blood. You can't escape. I knew then that Shadow was still out there, still watching me. It was playing with me, tormenting me. I had to find a way to stop it, to end this nightmare once and for all. I decided to go back to the dark web, to find whoever had made this thing and make them fix it. I spent hours searching, going deeper and deeper into the darkest corners, and finally, I found something. A forum. Hidden deep within the web, where people shared stories of their own custom pets gone wrong. It was filled with horror stories, each one more disturbing than the last. People talked about pets that turned on them, that attacked their families, that drove them to madness. And always there was the same warning. Once you order, you can never escape. I posted my own story, hoping for answers. And within minutes, I got a reply. You can't fight it. You have to accept it. Embrace it. I didn't understand what they meant, but I was desperate. I replied, begging for help, for anything that could end this. The response was chilling. You can't end it. It ends you. I felt a cold dread settle over me. I realized then that I had made a deal with something far beyond my understanding, something evil, and there was no way out. As I sit here, writing this, I can feel its eyes on me. Shadow is coming for me, and I know this time I won't escape. If you're reading this, take my warning seriously. Don't go looking for things that should stay hidden. Some doors should never be opened. And if you ever see a dog with glowing red eyes, run. Run as fast as you can. Because once it finds you, there's no escaping it. I don't even know how to start this part. It feels like my sanity is slipping through my fingers, and every moment is a waking nightmare. Writing this is the only thing that keeps me grounded, even if just a little. So here goes. After I realized the true depth of the horror I was in, I knew I couldn't face it alone. I reached out to an old friend, Mike, who had dabbled in some weird shit over the years. If anyone could help me, it was him. We hadn't talked in ages, but when I called, he answered on the first ring. Mike, it's Dan, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need your help. It's something bad. Really bad. There was a pause on the other end. Dan? Jesus, man, you sound like hell. What's going on? I told him everything. I could hear the skepticism in his voice at first, but as I went on, it turned to genuine concern. Mike had seen a lot, but even he was shaken by what I described. All right, he finally said. I'll come over, just hang tight. Mike showed up a few hours later, looking like he hadn't aged a day since college. He had this aura of calm around him, like nothing could faze him. But when he saw the state of my apartment and the scratches on my arms, his expression changed. Jesus, Dan, he muttered. What the hell did you get yourself into? We sat down, and I went over everything again. Mike listened, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the horror. When I finished, he sat back, rubbing his temples. This is bad, he said. Really bad. You said you got this thing from the dark web? That's some deep, dark shit, man. I know, I replied, feeling the weight of my mistakes. But how do I stop it? How do I get my life back? Mike was silent for a moment, then stood up. We need to find out who made this thing. There's got to be a way to trace it back. Find out who's behind it. I nodded, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. Mike pulled out his laptop and got to work, diving into the dark web with a skill that was both impressive and unsettling. Hours passed as he hacked and dug through layers of encryption and hidden sites. Finally, he found something. Here, he said, pointing to the screen. This is the site you used, right? I looked at the familiar black background and white text and nodded. Yeah, that's it. Mike clicked around, pulling up logs and hidden pages. Looks like they used some serious security to keep their tracks covered. But there's a pattern here, a traceable code. If I can follow it, we might be able to find the source. He worked through the night, barely speaking, his eyes glued to the screen. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion overtook me. When I woke up, Mike was still at it, looking haggard but determined. "I found something," he said, his voice hoarse. "An address. It's not much, but it's a lead." The address was in a rundown part of town, a place where people went to disappear. We decided to check it out that evening, hoping to find some answers. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like Shadow's eyes were on me even now. We arrived at the address, a decrepit building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Mike and I exchanged a glance, and he nodded, signaling for me to follow him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. We moved cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The place was empty, but there was something off about it, a sense of malevolence that made my skin crawl. We found a staircase leading to the basement and descended into the gloom. At the bottom, we found a room filled with old computer equipment and files. Mike started going through them, looking for anything that could give us a clue. "That's odd," he muttered, pulling out a stack of papers. "These are records of orders. There are hundreds of them, all for custom pets." As he flipped through the pages, he found my order. "Here," he said, showing it to me. "This is yours. And look, there's a name at the bottom. Dr. Felix Marlowe." "Who the hell is that?" I asked, my heart racing. "No idea," Mike replied. "But it's a start. We need to find this guy." We took the records and left, the oppressive atmosphere of the building weighing on us. Back at my apartment, we started researching Dr. Marlowe. It took hours, but we finally found a lead. He was a geneticist who had disappeared years ago after being involved in some highly controversial experiments. Rumor had it he was working on something called Project Chimera, which involved splicing animal and human DNA. "This guy is a fucking mad scientist," Mike said, shaking his head. "If he's behind this, we're dealing with something way beyond our pay grade." We managed to find an old address for Marlowe, a secluded house in the woods outside of town. It was a long shot, but we had no other options. We geared up, grabbing anything we could think of for protection, and headed out. The drive was tense, the silence between us filled with unspoken fears. When we finally arrived, the house was exactly what I expected: creepy, dilapidated, and isolated. We approached cautiously, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. The door was unlocked, and we entered, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The inside was worse than the outside, with broken furniture and strange symbols painted everywhere. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. We searched the house, finding more evidence of Marlowe's experiments. Papers and diagrams littered the floors, all detailing grotesque combinations of human and animal traits. My stomach turned as I realized the extent of his work. Then we heard it, a low growl coming from the basement. My blood ran cold. We looked at each other, knowing what we had to do. We descended the stairs, the growling growing louder with each step. At the bottom, we found a large reinforced cage. Inside was Shadow, but it was different. It looked even more monstrous, its eyes blazing with a malevolent intelligence. And beside the cage stood an old man, his eyes wild and crazed. "Dr. Marlowe, I presume?" Mike said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The man turned to us, a twisted smile on his face. "Ah, visitors. Welcome to my humble abode. I see you've met my finest creation." "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What did you do?" "I gave you exactly what you asked for," Marlowe replied, his smile widening. "A loyal pet, one that would scare anyone who saw it. And it seems it did its job quite well." "You're insane," Mike spat. "This thing killed his girlfriend." Marlowe shrugged. "Collateral damage, a necessary sacrifice for progress." I felt a surge of rage and fear. "How do we stop it? How do we end this?" "You can't," Marlowe said, his voice cold. "Once the bond is formed, it cannot be broken. Shadow will always find you." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. No matter what we did, Shadow would always be there, waiting. Suddenly, Shadow lunged at the cage, snarling and snapping its jaws. The cage rattled, and I could see the metal bending under the strain. Marlowe just laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the basement. "You see," he said, "it's perfect. My masterpiece." I knew then that we had to destroy Marlowe and his creation. But how? The cage wouldn't hold for long. and we were running out of time. "Mike," I whispered, "we need to end this. Now." He nodded, his face grim. We grabbed whatever we could find: tools, pipes, anything that could be used as a weapon. Marlowe watched us, his eyes gleaming with madness. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Try to stop me." With a roar of rage, we attacked. Marlowe fought back, but he was no match for our desperation. We overpowered him, tying him up and turning our attention to the cage. Shadow was furious, its eyes locked on me with a hatred that was almost palpable. "We need to burn it," Mike said, his voice urgent. "The whole place. It's the only way." I nodded, knowing he was right. We doused the basement in gasoline, the acrid smell filling the air. As we lit the fire, Marlowe screamed, a sound of pure, unhinged terror. We ran, the flames spreading quickly, consuming everything in their path. Outside, we watched as the house burned, the heat intense and the light blinding. Shadow's growls and Marlowe's screams echoed in the night, and I prayed that this was the end. But even as the house crumbled into ashes, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a dark shadow over my soul. We had destroyed Marlowe and his twisted creation, but the scars would never heal. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those red eyes staring back at me. I knew I would never be free of this nightmare. Shadow would always be a part of me, a constant reminder of the horrors I had unleashed. And if you're reading this, remember, some things are better left alone. Curiosity can lead to unimaginable terror. Learn from my mistakes. Don't go looking for monsters, because you might just find them. It's been weeks since we burned Marlowe's house down, and I wish I could say things got better. But they didn't. The nightmares still haunt me every night, filled with those red eyes and the smell of burning flesh. The police investigated the fire, but we were careful to leave no trace of our presence. They chalked it up to an electrical fault, another abandoned building gone up in flames. No one cared enough to look deeper. Mike tried to help me move on, but even he seemed shaken by what we had seen. We kept in touch, but the calls grew less frequent. I think he wanted to forget, to push it all behind him and pretend it never happened. I wished I could do the same. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A soft scratching at the window. My heart stopped. I sat up, listening intently. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails on glass. I got out of bed, moving quietly, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my nightstand. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, so there was no way it could be a person. I crept towards the window, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to hide, but I had to know. I pulled back the curtain, and there it was. Shadow. Its red eyes glowing in the darkness, its mouth twisted into that familiar, sinister grin. It was perched on the fire escape, its massive form barely fitting on the narrow metal platform. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Without thinking, I swung the bat at the window, shattering the glass. Shadow didn't flinch, it just stared at me, those eyes burning into my soul. I backed away, my mind racing. How was it here? We had destroyed it, hadn't we? I ran to the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. I had to get out, to escape. But as I opened the door, I heard a low growl behind me. I turned, and there it was, standing in the shattered remains of the window, its eyes fixed on me. I bolted, running down the hallway and out of the building. I didn't stop until I was halfway across town, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. I found myself in front of Mike's apartment, and without thinking, I pounded on the door. Mike opened it, his eyes widening in shock when he saw me. "Dan, what the hell are you doing here?" "It's back!" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Shadow. It's back!" Mike's face went pale. He let me in, locking the door behind me. We sat in his living room, the tension thick in the air. I told him what had happened, and he listened, his expression grim. "This is bad, Dan," he said finally. "Really bad. We need to figure out what to do." "We burned it," I said, my voice shaking. "We burned the house, the cage, everything. How is it still here?" "I don't know," Mike replied, "but we need to find out. There's got to be something we missed, some connection we didn't break." We spent the next few days researching, trying to find any clue that could explain Shadow's return. Mike reached out to some of his contacts, people who dealt with the occult and the supernatural. Most of them thought we were crazy, but one old man, a retired professor, agreed to meet with us. His name was Dr. Edwin Crane, and he specialized in folklore and dark rituals. We met him at a small cafe, and he listened intently as we told our story. When we finished, he was silent for a long time, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "I've heard of such things," he said finally. "Creatures bound by dark rituals, created through forbidden science. It sounds like your friend Marlowe was dabbling in things best left alone." "Can we stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "There has to be a way to break the bond." Dr. Crane nodded slowly. "There might be. If Marlowe used ancient rituals, there would be a counter-ritual, a way to sever the connection. But it won't be easy. You'll need to find the original ritual and perform the counter-ritual in the same place where Shadow was created." "His house burned down," Mike said, his voice grim. "There's nothing left." "Then you'll need to find another location tied to the creature's creation," Dr. Crane replied. "Someplace with strong emotional or ritual significance. And you'll need a piece of the creature, something to bind it to the ritual." I felt a sinking dread in my stomach. "What kind of piece?" "A tooth, a claw, something connected to its essence," Dr. Crane said. "Be careful. These creatures are powerful and dangerous." We thanked Dr. Crane and left, our minds racing with the enormity of the task ahead. We had to find a way to get a piece of Shadow and then figure out where it had been created. It felt impossible, but we had no other choice. That night, I went back to my apartment, determined to face whatever came. I didn't sleep, waiting for the inevitable scratching at the window, but it never came. Instead, there was a knock at the door. I opened it cautiously, and there stood Mike, looking haggard and worried. "I found something," he said, holding up a piece of paper. "An old record from Marlowe's experiments. It mentions a lab in the woods outside of town, another place he used for his work. We drove out there, the tension in the car palpable. The lab was hidden deep in the forest, a crumbling building covered in vines and moss. It felt like stepping into a nightmare, the air thick with the smell of decay. Inside, we found rows of cages and tables covered in old, rusted instruments. Papers littered the floor, detailing horrific experiments and twisted creations. And then we found it, a small, locked room at the back of the lab. We broke the lock and stepped inside, and there it was. Shadow. It was chained to the wall, its eyes burning with a malevolent rage. It growled low, straining against the chains. "We need to get a piece," Mike whispered, his voice shaking. "A tooth, a claw, something." I took a deep breath and approached the creature, my hands trembling. Shadow snarled, snapping its jaws at me. I reached out, trying to steady my nerves, and managed to grab one of its claws. With a quick, desperate yank, I pulled it free. Shadow howled in pain, and I stumbled back, clutching the claw. Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the door. "We need to go, now!" We ran, the sound of Shadow's howls echoing in the lab. Back at the car, we drove away as fast as we could, not stopping until we were miles away. "We have the piece," I said, holding up the claw. "Now we just need to find the right place." Mike nodded, his face grim. "We'll figure it out. We have to." As we drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadow was still out there, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. We had to end this, once and for all. And deep down, I knew the final confrontation was coming. The nightmare was far from over. We had the claw, a key piece for the counter-ritual, but we still needed a location tied to Shadow's creation. Mike and I scoured every document and record we could find about Marlowe's experiments, looking for any hint of a place with significant emotional or ritual meaning. It was a grueling process, but finally we found a lead. An old family estate Marlowe had inherited, deep in the countryside. It was remote, surrounded by dense forest, and according to the records, it was where Marlowe had first begun his experiments. We set out early the next morning, determined to put an end to this nightmare. The drive was long and silent, both of us lost in our thoughts, the weight of what we were about to do hanging heavy in the air. The closer we got to the estate, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and a sense of dread settled over me. The estate was in ruins, overgrown with weeds and vines. The main house was a crumbling shell, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. We parked the car and approached cautiously, the forest around us eerily silent. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. We made our way through the house, searching for any sign of a ritual space. It wasn't long before we found it. A basement room hidden behind a false wall, filled with strange symbols and ancient texts. This had to be the place. We set up for the ritual, following the instructions Dr. Crane had given us. We lit candles, drew the necessary symbols, and placed the claw in the center of the circle. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that Shadow was lurking just beyond the edges of the light. When everything was ready, Mike began the incantation. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The room seemed to grow colder with each word, and the shadows in the corners deepened. I kept my eyes on the claw, watching for any sign that the ritual was working. Then I heard it, a low growl coming from the darkness. I turned, and there it was. Shadow stood in the doorway, its red eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It stepped into the room, its growl growing louder, more menacing. "Keep going!" I shouted to Mike, raising the baseball bat I had brought. "Finish the ritual!" Shadow lunged at me, its jaws snapping. I swung the bat, but it barely seemed to faze the creature. It was too strong, too fast. It knocked me to the ground, its claws digging into my flesh. Pain shot through me, but I refused to give up. Mike's voice grew louder, the incantation reaching its climax. The symbols on the floor began to glow, and the air crackled with energy. Shadow turned its attention to Mike, its growl turning into a roar. It charged at him, but just as it reached the circle, there was a blinding flash of light. The creature let out a piercing howl, its body convulsing as the ritual took hold. The air was filled with the smell of burning flesh, and Shadow's form began to dissolve, turning into a swirling mass of darkness and light. It thrashed and screamed, but it couldn't break free. With one final, agonized howl, Shadow disintegrated, the darkness fading into nothing. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the candles. I lay on the floor, gasping for breath, my body aching from the struggle. Mike stood over me, his face pale but determined. "It's over," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We did it." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. We had faced the nightmare and come out the other side, but the scars would remain. We gathered our things and left the estate, the oppressive weight lifting as we stepped back into the sunlight. The drive back was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts, processing what we had just been through. Back in the city, life slowly began to return to normal. The nightmares became less frequent, and the scratches on my arms healed, leaving only faint scars. Mike and I stayed in touch, our shared experience forging a bond that wouldn't easily break. But even now, I can't completely shake the feeling of being watched, of Shadow's presence lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. I know the danger is gone, but the memory of those red eyes haunts me. I've learned to live with it, to move on, but I'll never forget. So, if you're reading this, take my warning to heart. The dark web is a place of unimaginable horrors, and some things should never be sought out. Curiosity can lead to nightmares, and some doors should never be opened. And if you ever find yourself staring into the glowing red eyes of a creature that should not exist, remember this: run, and don't look back. Because once you invite the darkness in, it will never truly leave.